Yeah. Make sure it's muted. All right, there we go. All right, where I believe we left off this last Monday is we were talking about Alfred Adler, which was one of our first neo-Freudians that is going to de-emphasize the sex drive that Freud originally um, um, proposed as one of our primary drives. And we start with Alfred Adler because he kind of went to the extreme and said it's not about human sexuality that children go through these developmental phases. It's because we're kind of born into the world feeling inferior. We feel, we're not able to do things. And we spend our life trying to overcome this inferiority complex. And he very much relied on the focus of relationships, especially in early childhood. And again, I know I bring this up time and time and again. In a way, the Freudians were or neo-Freudians were kind of correct in that we do find that a major part of our personality and our identity develop between that age of about 2 to 6 years of age. The other thing that he did emphasize, and we'll get into later, is he was one of the first to emphasize birth order and how that shapes personality. We will, on Monday, explore another psychologist who went and researched birth order, and he kind of solidified some of the ideas that we have about it. But there's been many challenges to that since those theories were developed, which we'll get to on Monday. He did identify that we basically have three fundamental social tasks in life. He said occupational, which is our career, societal, which is our friendships and our community, and our love tasks in finding an intimate partner. And he argued that someone who has a healthy personality instead of some type of mental health complex tends to focus on those three social tasks. And invest their energies into those. And that's what develops a good, strong, healthy personality. Okay. So let's move on. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because we talked about it in the developmental phase, but Erik Erikson, if you kind of think about it, through his 8 stages of development, argued that personality develops through each of those conflicts that we go through in each of those 8 stages. What should be emphasized with Erikson when it comes to personality is, one, he said a healthy personality is a sense of competence and successful completion of those 8 stages. Remember, we put those 8 stages, though, on a continuum. Between trust and mistrust. We're all somewhere kind of in between that. And so a lot of theorists have taken that more continuum look. And when you do the kind of the math of it, there's over 100,000 different ways a personality could turn out based on those 8 stages and where you lay on that continuum. So mathematically, it really does kind of emphasize that there's complexity to personality based on these 8 stages. The other thing that we should note about these 8 stages is this also means our personality changes over time. That each stage of conflict adds another dimension to our personality. And so we're going to kind of see with Erikson that the breaking from the traditional idea that personality is set in early childhood and the argument that our personality actually changes over time, dependent upon the stage of life we're in. And so we'll explore this when we kind of get to trait theories, which basically say that traits are kind of fixed. But one challenge I would give everyone in the room is that personality assessment. I would challenge you to take it, for this class, but then a year from now, take it again, and you'll see that your scores probably slightly shift. I remember when I very, very, very first started teaching, that was 13 years ago or more, and I took the assessment, and I was on the extreme end of introversion. But over the years of teaching, and I don't know if it's because of teaching or anything else, my scores have become less and less extreme, to where I'm still considered what's considered introverted, but I'm slowly being less and less introverted and getting to that midpoint between introversion and extroversion. So, and that's something that Erickson's model would have predicted. So, Carl Jung, and again, he is the predecessor of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud kind of anointed him his torchbearer, but he is going to change his ideas of Freudian theory. And I should say that if you read a lot of Native American psychology, you will note Carl Jung being mentioned quite a bit, and I'll explain why that is here in just a minute. But do remember, it was Carl Jung. If you remember, we talked about where the term personality came from. It came from this term persona, which is a mask that was worn during Greek tragedies, played by a actor. And he used this term because he felt that people hide their true self dependent upon the social situation. And again, if you think about, when you're at a club versus in a classroom versus home alone, we kind of act slightly different to fit to the situation. And he feels that we're constantly in a compromise between being authentic or a true self and the self that society expects of us. And so in order to deal with that, we kind of hide behind our true self, is kind of hiding behind that persona we put off. And if you remember, when I talked about psychopathic serial killers, this is kind of an extreme example of that. When I talked about the serial killer I worked with, she had the persona of the perfect church lady, but behind that was that psychopathic person who had extreme hatred for men, and therefore she went on to like I said, she used to burn down the house with the man in it, and usually it was an 11 or 12-year-old boy. And so that person was hiding behind that persona that she presented to the world. Now, that's an extreme example, but in some sense, we kind of all do this. And so that's something to kind of think about. And again, the connection that Carl Jung has with Native American psychology is, in Western psychology, he was the first to look at what's called the collective unconscious. Okay. And the collective unconscious is basically kind of some universal, we consider these culturally based now, of a personal unconscious that holds mental patterns and memory traces that deal with our past, that we bring part of who we are and where we came from, at least on an unconscious level, from our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents, going back to our history of the people we come from. And if you think about this sounds very familiar to something that's a very common topic among repressed groups like Native Americans, and that's historical trauma. Okay. where the idea is that the trauma of our past peoples play a role into our current lives right now. And again, I think I mentioned this just shortly at the beginning of the semester. We're actually finding some genetic tracers that actually can go back to the traumas of our past ancestors that are linked to different genetic markers within our genetic makeup. Okay. But he did believe, and the reason he believed in the collective unconscious is across cultures, we tend to all have, or born with, or within the culture, certain archetypes. So when we look across cultures, we tend to find that there's an inborn, almost innate representation of a mother and a father, and of siblings, and the family system. It seems, you don't have to, for example, teach an infant what a mother is or a father is. It tends to instantly evolve as the infant develops. And we find the notion of mother and father across cultures. We also find the archetype of the hero and the villain across cultures. In every culture that we know of, you will find some notion of the protector, the hero, the archetype of someone who does right. And then we have an archetype of those who are the villains within a society, the people who bring about evilness. And hero versus villain, again, like mother and father, are things that don't need to be taught. Okay, and so you'll see if you get into Native American psychology, there's a lot of reference to Carl Jung because of this idea of collective unconscious, the idea of archetypes that go across cultures, but also archetypes that exist within cultures. And so, and again, Carl Jung, again, when it comes to personality, he felt there's a difference between the true self and the self we present to society, which we will see again reappear when we get to humanistic psychology, when we talk about the real self versus the imagined self. And the collective unconscious builds into our personality system based upon the peoples we come from. And their past influence the behaviors we have today, at least on an unconscious level. Okay. And the other big contribution that Carl Jung gave to the study of personality is probably one of the most well-studied personality traits, which is extroversion versus introversion. And as you can see in this graph, it kind of gives some personality or behavior qualities of an introversion and personality qualities of an extroversion. But I want to spend some time talking about these two concepts because we need to add a third column in here called shyness, especially when we're talking about introversion. Okay. And to tell if you're an introvert versus an extrovert, let's talk about the two extreme, an extreme introvert and an extreme extrovert. Okay. Is it really depends on what energizes you, what brings back your feeling of excitement and virile when you've done something that has been kind of exhausting, such as sitting through one of Dr. Peterson's classes, or even things like going to the gym or doing something physical that then exhausts you. If you tend to get energized by spending some time alone, and that provides you with the ability to then go about the rest of your daily tasks, you're more on the introverted side of the scale. If, however, you get excited and energized by talking with people and interacting in a group and being that way, then you're more on the extroverted side of the realm. And I can bring this up. Most educators tend to be extroverted. And so, there's a major difference between my fellow instructors when we get back to an office. After a class, as an introvert, I kind of need to go to my office and have some moments of silence and quiet reflection before I go on with my day. But my colleagues come back to the office and they're jumping from office to office, talking to all the other instructors, and I find it quite annoying, to be honest with you, but I love them for stopping by anyways. But that's how they regain their energy after doing a class and being engaged in this mental task that you and I are engaged in as a student and instructor. So that's really how you tell the difference between extroverts and introverts. And it's important to note an introvert does not want necessarily social interaction. Most introverts do still seek social interactions, but they're more likely to be that person in the coffee shop that is kind of in the corner, just enjoying and watching other people. They're more likely to be the ones who go to a social event and they're there, they'll talk, but they don't necessarily engage people into talking and those kinds of things. So an introvert is not a social isolate. They're not someone who is afraid of social situations. Okay. And then again, the extrovert does enjoy some quiet time now and then. They enjoy sometimes of having themselves to do their own self-reflection. So it's not that an extrovert is scared of being alone. So this is not a fear of social situations or fear of being alone dynamic. That's not extroversion or introversion. When we look at, for example, fears of being in social situation, that's shyness. Shyness is the fear of having to socially interact with others, and people who get anxiety when they're about to enter a social situation. That's shyness, and it's not necessarily related to either introverted or extroverted, because we can find people who are shy who are extremely extroverted, and it's frustrating to them that they can't put themselves into a social situation because of that fear that they have of that situation. And we do find introverts who are shy, and yes, it is true, there's more introverts that have shyness than extroverts. But the point being is that you can't think of introversion and extroversion as a fear factor, because I'll just repeat again, an introvert isn't afraid of being social, and an extrovert is not afraid of being alone. When we're dealing with that, we're dealing with things like shyness. On the other end of it, extra person who fears about being alone, we're talking about someone who has a dependency issue or a codependency issue, and they feel like they can't survive without someone else being in their life. That's dependency or codependency. It's not these two personality factors. And so that's something to consider when you're looking at these two, and you got to separate the fears from these two categories. All right. And then I think it is worth noting that all Freudians were not male. In fact, Anne Freud, who is Freud's daughter, was very much took the torch of Freud. One more famous one is Karen Horney, who agreed with Jung, and this is something to state. He agreed with Jung that individuals have the potential for this kind of thing we call self-realization of this. There's this healthier self setting behind, there's this authentic self sitting behind the face we put on as we go through the world. But he did disagree. She did disagree with the idea of this penis envy that I mentioned that Jung came up with for young ladies, and suggested that what Jung was referring to, and even Freud was referring to, was something of jealousy, and is culturally based. And that there's all kinds of jealousy surrounded around what women have versus what men have, but this isn't something that then drives the person um, to act in a certain way. She also was one of the first to state that men and women, the difference between men and women is culturally based. It's not biologically based. That what we see, when we talk about, and again, we're going to see this. This is kind of the forefront of feminist movement. She's going to say, yes, we have sex differences. So men have external genitalia, women have internal genitalia, and they serve a different reproductive um, um, uh, part. But the difference between men and women is something that is culturally based. And this is kind of counter to Freud's idea and counter to Jung's idea that men and women naturally develop into what they're supposed to do based on their drives and their favor for mom or favor for dad. But she is going to say so that men have what's called womb envy, because they cannot give birth. And I want to elaborate on this a little bit from a sociological perspective. In a lot of what we call masculine societies where men are dominated, where men dominate that society, and women are seen as a lower version of what the ultimate prize of humanness is, which is a male. We do see this idea that of what's called womb envy, that because women actually have the true power in the world. If you think about it, our societies would end without women being able to give birth to a child. We would stop existing as a species. And so the sociological explanation of masculine societies is that in order to deal with the idea that in the end men are not the ones with the ultimate power, we can't create something, and we can't create other humans. Yes, we can be involved in the process. Obviously, half of the genetics has to come from the man, but in the end, it's the woman who then develops the infant and gives birth to the infant, that men then take control socially. They exert themselves onto a society in order to deal with that conflict. That really, in the end, women are the ones who have the ultimate power to create human life. And so that kind of grew out. If you notice, a lot of these feminist ideas kind of grew out of Karen Horney. And if you read anything from Anne Freud, you'll find that a lot of the movements, such as the women's rights movement, the voting rights movement, the feminist movement, this idea that women are equals to, this is going to start in, at least from a theoretical basis, with Anne Freud and Karen Horney. And she's also going to defocus on the idea that we have these two basic drives. Yes, the aggression drive, but other drives. But she's going to focus on what's called unconscious anxiety. And she's going to say that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxieties from from needs not being met. Okay, so this, if you want to think about this is a child who is being neglected, not having proper social relationships and whatnot with the parent, and not bonding with the parent properly, and not having a safe, consistent environment. And she argued that there's three types of coping strategies that children use to relieve these anxieties. The first one is moving towards people. So this is affiliation and dependency. And again, if we go back to Erickson's model, for example, trust, mistrust. If you're more on the mistrust and or on the more on the shame and end of the continuum as a child develops, we said there's two outcomes for those children. One is they move against people, which is number two, or they move towards people. And so this is the child who over attaches, if you want to put it in these terms, to a caregiver, either mother or someone who is their caregiver, a grandparent or the like. And they have extreme anxiety when they're separated from that parent figure. Now, all children initially, when they separate from their parents, so we're talking the first days of childcare, the first days of preschool, have anxiety about their secure base leaving them in a place that they don't no longer have access to them. But when we're talking about these children, they're the children who kick and scream and hold on to mom's leg as mom tries to leave the child there. Okay, so this is that moving towards people, and we find, or Horney observed that as adults, these children tend to need an intense need for love and acceptance. They go through it if they're rejected by individuals or loved ones. They tend to be those individuals who kind of feel like their life is ending. If you want to put it on a clinical perspective, these are individuals who are going to develop what's called dependency disorder or codependency disorder. And this is where a person has the inability to kind of, in a sense, take care of themselves without a relationship of some type that they depend upon for their emotional, social, and biological needs. And then again, if you remember, we have that moving against people. So this is the child who is aggressive and assertive. And now I want to explain assertiveness right here. This is assertiveness without any type of provocation. So this isn't a child who is being deprived of their needs, and then they feel that in order to get their need met, they need to be assertive, like we would as adults, as you would think. No, we're talking about a child who, if it's not going their way, if it's not their want and desire that's being met, they will then assert themselves in a way that eventually they will get what they want. So this, if you want to think about this, this is a child who throws excessive tantrums when they don't get what they want, if you want to think about it that way. And again, Horney theorized that as adults, these individuals are the ones who are likely to lash out very quickly to others and tend to exploit others for their own needs. Okay. The third one, which it looks like it has a 2, but this should be 3, is young children who move away from people. So we have people who overattach, people who are aggressive and assertive towards others, and then we're going to have the person who is going to isolate themselves from others and detach from others. If you remember, this is the example I gave when we were talking about Erickson, about the family gets together, and 2 hours into the gathering, Uncle Joe says, "Hey, has anyone seen Billy?" And so they go look for young Billy, and they find him 2 blocks down playing in some neighbor's yard, not caring about whether or not anyone is there or not. And remember, that comes from that chaotic environment where parents blame the child for needing a need met, such as food or warmth or their diaper changed, as an example. And Horney is going to argue that as an adults, these are individuals who avoid love and friendship and avoid interaction. Again, when we look back at Erikson theory, this is the one who psychologically isolates. So they're going to invest themselves into non-human endeavors. So this is a young person who becomes a workaholic. If we were to stereotype, this is the woman who becomes the cat woman. This is the man who becomes the dog man, and they invest completely into their pets instead of human relationships. Okay. So those are three things to consider, right? And there's some evidence for and against these ideas. We've talked about it with Erikson, and we've talked about it in development in general about what happens when a child doesn't appropriately attach in early childhood. But again, you're seeing this focus on early childhood and its influence on adults. And we have to say, we'll say this on Monday, you'll find that this relationship is much more complex than what we think it is. And if you had a horrible childhood, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be aggressive or dependent or detached and isolated. The picture is a lot more complicated than these early theories would suggest. Okay. So I promised that we wouldn't spend too much time today talking about these things. So I just wanted to finish up those neo-Freudian. There are a lot more that we can talk about. There's Erich Fromm and others that if you're interested in learning more about the Freudian movement and the neo-Freudians, it is interesting stuff. It does have it can explain some of the things that we think about here in Western culture. I mentioned the oral phase and the assumption of obesity and the anal phase and why we call someone anal. And so there are a lot of cultural things that have come out of the Freudian movement. But again, I'm going to say this again. Most of the Freudian theories focused on that early childhood experience in developing our personality and our identity. I mentioned that, yes, this is true to some extent because between about the 3 to 6 years, we do kind of mold our identity through play and through observational play and all of those types of things, which we will see when we get to social cognitive theory of development. It kind of explains these things a little bit better with Albert Bandura. But this is the state of affairs we're at. And I'm going to kind of stop here. I